The door had barely swung open before the laughter started. Not nervous laughter. Not the kind that hides discomfort. No. This was loud, deliberate, cutting laughter. The kind aimed directly at a person like a weapon. And the man standing at the entrance of First Continental Bank on that cold, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon had done nothing to deserve it except walk through the wrong door in the wrong coat. He was old. His shoes were split at one side. His coat, once a deep navy, had faded to a dull gray somewhere between 10 and 20 years of hardware. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he was watching everything. His eyes moved quietly around the marble lobby. The tall ceilings, the polished counters, the way the junior staff stood a little too straight whenever the manager passed. He took it all in without a word. Then a voice cut through the room like a blade. "Sir." Kevin Parker leaned against the counter with a smirk already forming. "This isn't a soup kitchen. The shelter is 3 blocks down. You can't miss it." 2 customers chuckled. A teller looked away. A security guard shifted his weight but said nothing. The old man paused. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He simply looked at Kevin the way a person looks at something they expected to find but hoped they wouldn't. Then he adjusted the collar of his faded coat, walked calmly to the counter, and said in a voice that was quiet but completely steady, "I'd like to speak with someone about an account." Kevin's smirk widened. "What account?" "One I've held for quite some time." "Right." Kevin clicked his tongue. "And what's the account number, sir, or the name on the account?" "Jonathan Reed." The name meant nothing to Kevin. He typed something lazily into his keyboard, glanced at the screen for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked back at the old man with the expression of someone who has already decided the conversation is over. "Nothing comes up. You sure you have the right bank?" "I'm quite sure," Jonathan said. "Well, I can't help you without proper ID, account documentation, and a valid reason to take up counter space during business hours." Kevin folded his arms. "Is there anything else?" Jonathan didn't move. He looked slowly around the lobby again, at the cameras in the corners, at the staff who were watching without watching, at the manager's glass office where a man in a blue suit was too busy staring at his phone to notice any of this. Then Jonathan said something that made the nearest customers go quiet. "Interesting. So this is how my bank treats people now." Kevin blinked. Then he laughed again, though this time it was slightly less sure of itself. "Your bank?" "Yes," Jonathan said simply. Kevin looked at his colleague beside him, a young woman named Dana, and they exchanged the kind of look that says, "Did you hear this guy?" Then he turned back and shook his head. "Okay, sir. I think it's time for you to leave before I call security." The old man nodded once, slowly, as though confirming something he already knew. Then he walked to the row of waiting chairs along the far wall, sat down, folded his hands on his lap, and waited. Nobody quite knew what to do with that. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. His name was Jonathan Reed, and almost nobody alive knew his full story. He had not always been old. He had not always been quiet. There was a version of Jonathan Reed that existed 40 years ago. A young man with holes in his shoes and fire in his chest, sleeping on a pull-out cot in a rented room above a laundromat, studying balance sheets by lamplight because he couldn't afford electricity in the actual sense of the word. Only the extension cord he ran through the hallway from a shared outlet. He had grown up the son of a farmhand in a small rural county where the concept of inherited wealth was not just foreign. It was a joke people told at someone else's expense. His father worked other men's land. His mother cleaned other women's houses. Jonathan learned early that the world sorted people into those who were seen and those who weren't. And he had spent the better part of 6 decades making himself impossible to ignore, though not in the way most people would expect from a man who now quietly controlled assets exceeding $4 billion. He built his first financial company from a single rented office the size of a large closet, with a second-hand desk, a telephone, and an idea so specific and carefully thought through that the first bank that rejected his loan application called him back 14 months later to offer him double. He declined. He had already found another way. He always found another way. Over 4 decades, what began as a small community lending firm became First Continental Financial Group, one of the nation's largest banking institutions, with branches in 42 states, a staff of over 12,000 employees, and a headquarters building whose lobby ceiling cost more to construct than his entire childhood neighborhood had been worth. He had built all of it. His name was on the founding charter. But Jonathan was not the kind of man who wore his wealth on the outside. His executive team knew that. His board members knew it. The cleaning staff at his private office building knew it, because he always learned their names and asked about their families, which was more than most of the vice presidents did. He drove an ordinary car. He flew commercial when security concerns allowed it. He ate lunch at simple restaurants. Not because he was performing humility. He genuinely had no interest in the theater of wealth. He had seen too many men disappear inside it. What had recently disturbed his peace, however, were the complaints. They had begun arriving 3 months ago, not in dramatic fashion, not a flood, but a slow trickle of customer feedback reports that his internal team flagged for his personal review. A customer in the West Side branch said she had been made to feel stupid for asking a basic question about her account. A man in his 80s reported that a teller had spoken to him as though he were a child. 2 customers at different locations mentioned being ignored when they tried to report suspicious activity on their accounts. And one letter, handwritten, which was how Jonathan knew it was genuine, described an employee openly mocking a woman's clothing in front of other customers. The reports were sent up the chain. Managers were notified. Performance reviews were flagged. And then, according to the internal process, the matters were considered resolved. But Jonathan had sat with those reports for a long time. He had read and reread that handwritten letter. And he had made a decision that his executive assistant described later as the most Jonathan Reed thing she had ever witnessed. He was going to go see for himself, not with a committee. Not with a camera crew, not with advance notice. He would visit branches unannounced, dressed in the most ordinary way he could manage, and simply observe what happened when someone who looked like he had nothing walked through the door of his own bank. His personal security lead had objected immediately and strenuously, and then, understanding that this was not a negotiation, had reluctantly agreed to a protocol in which 2 plainclothes officers would observe from outside each location while Jonathan was inside. This was the 3rd branch he had visited. The first 2 had passed. He had walked in, been greeted professionally, been assisted without judgment, and left without incident. One teller at the 2nd branch had even noticed that he seemed cold from the rain and quietly asked if she could get him a cup of water while they sorted out his inquiry. He had noted her name, but the Meridian Avenue branch, this branch, Kevin Parker's branch, had been the one that appeared most frequently in the complaint data. And within 4 minutes of walking through the door, Jonathan understood why. Back in the lobby, Kevin was now at his best. Emboldened by the fact that the old man had simply sat down rather than causing a scene, Kevin had returned to his colleagues with the comfortable posture of someone who had just handled a difficult situation well. He straightened his tie. He made a joke. Dana laughed, though without much conviction. It was Sarah Mitchell who didn't laugh. Sarah had been at her workstation when Jonathan walked in, halfway through a complicated account reconciliation that required her full attention. She had looked up when Kevin laughed the first time, and what she saw made something tighten in her chest. She kept watching without making it obvious. She saw an old man walk quietly to the waiting chairs and sit down. She saw him fold his hands with the particular stillness of someone who is not waiting to be helped so much as waiting to see what happens next, and she saw nobody move toward him. After 5 minutes, she saved her work, stood up, and walked over. "Sir," she said quietly, "my name is Sarah. Can I get you anything while you wait? Water, perhaps?" Jonathan looked up at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as though he were registering something important. "That would be very kind," he said. "Thank you." She brought him water. Then she crouched slightly so she was at eye level rather than standing over him, which was a small thing but the right thing, and she said, "Can you tell me what brought you in today? I want to make sure you're properly taken care of." "I wanted to make inquiries about an account," he said. "I was told there was nothing in the system. Let me look into that for you. What name is it under?" "Jonathan Reed." Sarah nodded and made no judgment about the name or what it might or might not mean. She walked back to her terminal, entered the name, and then went very still for a moment. She read what was on her screen once. Then she read it again. Then she straightened up and looked across the lobby at the old man sitting quietly in the chair with his worn coat and his paper cup of water. She walked back. "Mr. Reed," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might prefer to speak with someone in a private meeting room. Would that be all right?" Jonathan studied her face. "That would be fine," he said. He stood, and she guided him toward the small conference room near the back of the floor. As they passed the main counter, Kevin watched with narrowed eyes and the particular irritation of someone who feels that a protocol is being violated without anyone telling him what the protocol is. "Sarah," he called, "what are you doing?" "Assisting a client," she said without stopping. In the conference room, Jonathan sat across from Sarah and said nothing for a moment. Sarah placed her hands on the table and waited without filling the silence. "You looked me up," he said. "I did. And what did you find?" "I found enough to know," Sarah said, "that you should have been treated very differently from the moment you walked in." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Did you know who I was before you came to speak with me?" "No," she said. "I came because you were sitting alone and no one was helping you." There was a pause. Outside the glass conference room wall, the lobby continued its ordinary business. Kevin charmed a well-dressed couple at his counter. The manager, Robert Hayes, walked between workstations with the air of a man doing several important things at once. "Tell me about this branch," Jonathan said. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. "And in those 3 years, is what happened out there typical?" Sarah looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "There are some employees who take their cues from the clients they believe are valuable," she said, choosing her words. "And some clients are made to feel more valuable than others." "Based on what?" "What they look like, how they're dressed, whether they seem to have money, and management?" Sarah was quiet. "You can speak honestly," Jonathan said. "Management rewards performance," she said. "Sales numbers, client acquisition, the metrics that appear in reports. What happens in the spaces between those metrics is—" She paused, less closely examined. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. "You're very careful with your words." "I work here," she said simply. "I have to be." Something in Jonathan's expression shifted, and for the first time all afternoon, he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that carries something more than just the moment. "You shouldn't have to be," he said. "If you're still watching up to now, type 'I'm still here' in the comments section, and keep watching, because what happens in the next few minutes will change everything." They were in the conference room for nearly 20 minutes. Outside, Kevin noticed. He said something to Dana, who said something to the assistant manager, who said something to Robert Hayes. The manager straightened his jacket, looked at the conference room, and then looked at his watch with the expression of a man who has decided to wait before involving himself. But the afternoon had its own momentum now. Shortly after 4 o'clock, the first car arrived. A black sedan, corporate plates. Then a second, then a third. They pulled up outside the bank's glass frontage in a way that was unhurried but deliberate, and the men and women who stepped out of them were dressed in the kind of clothes that tend to make bank managers pay attention. Robert Hayes looked up from his desk. He didn't recognize the faces immediately, but something in their posture, the way they moved with the collective certainty of people arriving somewhere they were expected, made him push back his chair and stand up. 3 of them entered the lobby. They spoke to no one at the counter. They looked around the floor with the careful eyes of people who are cataloging what they see, and then the one in front, a tall woman with silver hair and a company ID badge that Hayes could not quite read from his office. looked directly through his glass wall, looked at him, and did not look away. Hayes came out of his office. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his voice carried slightly less authority than usual. "We're from the executive office," the woman said. "We're here to see Mr. Reed." The floor went quiet in the specific way that a floor goes quiet when something shifts in the air and everyone feels it before they understand it. Kevin Parker, standing at his counter with a client he was in the middle of impressing, stopped talking mid-sentence. "Mr. Reed," Hayes repeated carefully. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name scheduled to—" "He's in your conference room," the woman said. A pause. Hayes looked at the conference room. Through the glass, visible for the first time because Sarah had opened the blinds slightly, sat an old man in a worn coat. Across from him sat Sarah Mitchell. They appeared to be having a calm conversation, and the old man appeared to be doing most of the listening. Hayes blinked. "That man?" The executive turned to look at the conference room, then back at the manager. "Jonathan Reed," she said, "founder and majority owner of First Continental Financial Group." The silence that followed was the kind that fills lungs like cold water. Hayes's face went through several changes very quickly. Confusion, disbelief, the particular horror of a man rapidly reconstructing the last several hours in light of information that makes everything look completely different. Kevin Parker, who had been watching from his counter, did not move. His client said something to him and he didn't hear it. The conference room door opened. Jonathan Reed walked out first, with Sarah a half step behind him. He crossed the lobby floor without hurrying, and the extraordinary thing was that he walked with the same quiet steadiness he had walked in with 4 hours ago. Nothing about him had changed. Same coat, same shoes, same careful observing eyes. But the room looked at him completely differently now. "Mr. Reed," the executive said, stepping forward. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience." Jonathan raised one hand. "Margaret," he said, "I asked you to give me the afternoon. I understand, but given what the cameras, we'll review everything together." His tone was not unkind, but it was final. He turned to look at the lobby, at Hayes standing rigid near his office door, at Kevin behind the counter with the color leaving his face, at the other staff who had collectively forgotten how to behave naturally. He looked at all of them for a long moment. Then he said, to the room in general, "I'd like to see the manager's office." Hayes, operating now entirely on reflex, said, "Of course," and led the way. Jonathan followed. At the threshold he paused and turned back to Sarah, who had remained near the conference room entrance with the particular stillness of someone who does not know whether they are in trouble or not. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, "for the water, and for the conversation." She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything. Then Jonathan walked into the manager's office and closed the door behind him. What happened in that office over the next 45 minutes was reconstructed afterward from several accounts, including Hayes' own statement during the HR review, the executive team's documentation, and the account that Kevin Parker would give, much later, in a conversation he probably wished he hadn't had. Jonathan began by reviewing the security footage from the past 4 hours on Hayes' own computer, with Margaret and 2 other executives present. He watched in silence. Kevin's initial greeting played. The laughter, the comment about the soup kitchen, the refusal to properly search the account, the escalating dismissal. Sarah's arrival, the water, the redirection to the conference room. No one in the office spoke during the viewing. When it was finished, Jonathan sat back and asked Hayes a single question. "How many complaints have been filed about this branch in the past 18 months? Hayes began a sentence about metrics and customer feedback frameworks. Jonathan waited politely for him to finish, then asked again, more specifically. The number was not small. "And of those complaints," Jonathan continued, "how many were investigated and what were the outcomes?" The answers were not good. "I want to be clear about something," Jonathan said, and his voice was still quiet, still measured, still entirely without theatrics. "This is not about today. Today was a test, and this branch failed it. But the test was designed to show me something I was already seeing in the data. This is about a pattern, a culture, It is about what this institution has decided, whether explicitly or through what it chooses to reward and what it chooses to ignore. It is about what this institution has decided it stands for when no one is watching. He paused. I have been watching for 40 years, he said, and what I built was never meant to look like what I saw today. Hayes started to speak. Jonathan let him go for a few sentences. Something about pressure and targets and the difficulty of managing a large team. And then Margaret quietly placed a document on the desk. And Hayes stopped. Outside the office, the floor had not returned to normal and wouldn't. Kevin Parker stood at his counter serving no one because all his clients had drifted away, drawn off by the particular gravity of unfolding events. And he stood there with the hollow focus of a man who is rapidly understanding that the bravado he performed this afternoon has no useful place to go now. Dana touched his arm and said quietly, "Kevin." He didn't respond. The door to the manager's office opened at 5:43 in the afternoon. Jonathan came out first, followed by Margaret and the two other executives. Hayes was behind them, and he looked like a man who had been somehow reduced in size, though no physical dimension of him had changed. Jonathan walked to the center of the floor. The staff who were remaining, a handful of tellers, a few officers, Kevin, Dana, the security guard who had watched the morning's events without intervening, were all present. Some of the afternoon's customers had inexplicably lingered near the entrance, drawn by the sense that something important was still unresolved. Jonathan did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I want to say something to everyone in this room," he said, "and I want you to hear it plainly, without the kind of corporate language that tends to soften things until they mean nothing." He looked around slowly. His eyes passed over Kevin without pausing. "Every institution has a visible face and a real face," he said. "The visible face is the one in the advertisements, the annual reports, the promotional materials. It shows smiling employees and grateful clients and the language of service and dignity. The real face is what you find when you walk in looking like you have nothing, when you're not wearing the right clothes, when you don't drive the right car, when you look like someone who might not be worth the effort." The room was completely still. "I built this company," he continued, "from nothing, from less than nothing, from a position most of the people in this room would not recognize. And the principle I built it on, the one that was not negotiable, the one I wrote into the founding documents before anything else, was simple. Every person who walks through our door deserves to be treated as though they matter. Not because of what they have, not because of what they look like, but because they are a person." He paused. That principle was violated today, repeatedly and publicly, and without shame. Kevin Parker was staring at the floor. "Decisions will be made in the coming days about staffing and leadership at this branch," Jonathan said. "Those decisions are in the hands of the executive team and will follow the appropriate processes. What I want you to understand, every single one of you, is that the decisions are not arbitrary. They are a consequence. Character is something you perform every day, in the small moments, when you think no one important is watching. Every moment is important. Every person watching is important." He turned slightly toward where Sarah was standing near the back. "I have also seen something here today that I want to name equally clearly," he said. "I sat in a waiting chair and a member of your staff came to me with water and without judgment, before she had any reason to do anything except keep her head down and stay out of it. That is character. That is exactly what this institution is supposed to look like." Sarah pressed her lips together very hard and looked at the ceiling for a second. Jonathan turned back to the room. "That's all I wanted to say." There was a moment, brief, dense, where no one moved or breathed in any noticeable way. Then he walked toward the exit. At the door, he paused and turned back one final time. He looked at Kevin Parker, who had finally raised his eyes from the floor. "I came in today looking for answers," Jonathan said. "You gave me more than I came for." Then he pushed through the glass door into the early evening, where the rain had finally stopped, and the street was wet and gleaming, and two plainclothes officers fell in quietly on either side of him as he walked. The consequences arrived without delay, as consequences tend to when they have been a long time gathering. Kevin Parker was placed on immediate suspension pending review within 24 hours. 2 weeks later, following the full HR process and his own admission during the review that the behavior captured on the security footage was consistent with how he typically operated, he was terminated. He did not contest it. There are things you cannot argue with when they are on camera, and there are things you cannot argue with when you have already argued them in front of witnesses, and the witnesses include the owner of the company. Robert Hayes was removed from his position as branch manager and reassigned to a non-supervisory role pending a wider leadership review. The review, which was completed 8 weeks later, recommended that he not return to a management position, and he accepted an early retirement package shortly afterward. Margaret and the executive team commissioned a culture audit across all 42 states of First Continental branches. The audit, which took 6 months and involved anonymous interviews with over 2,000 employees and 3,000 clients, produced a report of considerable length and significant discomfort. 11 other branches were identified as having systemic issues with equitable service. Structural changes followed, and Sarah Mitchell received a call from Margaret's office 11 days after the afternoon in the lobby. She was offered a place in the company's leadership development program, a paid, structured 18-month track that prepared high-potential employees for branch management and senior client service roles. The offer had come with a note that was brief but specific. Jonathan Reed had recommended her personally, not because she had impressed a billionaire. The note was clear on this point in a way that felt intentional. He had recommended her because she had treated a stranger with basic human dignity at a moment when doing nothing would have been easy and doing something carried professional risk. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Sarah accepted. She cried a little, privately, in a way she would have denied if asked. The day Jonathan walked out of that branch, he made a note in his journal. He kept a journal, had kept one for 40 years, and the entry from that afternoon was shorter than most. It said, "Found what I was looking for. Also found what I was hoping to find. The second is rarer. Protect it when you do. There is a version of this story that ends with the punishment, the firing, the shame, the deserving comeuppance for a young man who let arrogance become his defining professional characteristic. That is a satisfying ending, and it is not without truth. Arrogance rarely meets consequences as cleanly as it should. And when it does, something in us feels the world click briefly into alignment. But the part of this story that Jonathan Reed held on to was not Kevin Parker's dismissal. It was the water. An ordinary cup of water offered to a man sitting alone in a chair. No camera pointed in a flattering direction. No audience to perform for. No reason to do it other than that it was the right thing to do. And a young woman named Sarah had decided, somewhere along the way, that the right thing was sufficient reason. He had been testing the institution, but the institution, in its best moment, had tested him too, had shown him that inside the same building where a man had mocked him with laughter, another person had quietly refused to become someone who would. He left the branch that evening with the knowledge that the problem was real and manageable, and that the solution to it was not hidden or theoretical or beyond reach. The solution was already present. It had been present the whole time, sitting 3 workstations from the door, waiting its turn. There is something in human nature that confuses visibility with importance. We treat the loudest person as the most significant. We mistake confidence for competence, presentation for character, the appearance of success for the substance of it. We look at a man in a worn coat and we decide, before he finishes his sentence, that he has nothing to teach us. And sometimes, not often enough, but sometimes, life arranges itself so that the man in the worn coat turns out to be the one who holds the keys to everything. Jonathan Reed stepped into the back seat of a waiting car. The driver glanced in the rear-view mirror. "How'd it go, sir?" Jonathan looked out the window at the wet street, at the gold light beginning to fall long and sideways across the buildings, at the ordinary city moving in its ordinary way. "Mostly how I expected," he said, "and a little better than I hoped." The car moved forward into the evening. What he didn't say, what he thought about later, quietly, in the way he thought about most things, was what he had said to the branch before he left. The words he had meant not just for the Meridian Avenue branch, not just for the people standing in that lobby, but for the wider truth that had built itself, brick by brick, across 40 years of watching what people did when they thought the moment didn't matter. The true measure of character is not how you treat the people who can do something for you. It is how you treat the person who, by every visible marker, appears to have nothing. Because dignity costs nothing, and it reveals everything. And the person you overlook today may be the one who changes the rest of your story. What would you have done in that moment? If you were standing in that bank lobby, watching all of this unfold, would you have been Kevin? Would you have been Sarah? Or would you have been one of the many people who watched and did nothing? Drop your honest answer in the comments. We're reading every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There are people in your life who are underestimated every day. Maybe this reminds us all to look a little differently. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. We post every week. Stories of character, consequence, wisdom, and the quiet moments that end up changing everything. Hit the bell notification so you're always first to know. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. That means more than you know. We'll see you in the next one.